It's wonderful. Anyway, good morning, everyone, especially to our Chancellor, who has worked so hard to make all of this come together. And I would like to thank my longtime colleague. I think we met some over 50 years ago, Yves Coppens, for his kind invitation to participate in this gathering of truly, if I can include myself, outstanding scholars who have come together to provide insight into the grandeur of the human mind through the lenses of philosophy, archaeology, ethnology, and in my case, biology. I very much appreciated this quote from Professor Koch. And so from a biological point of view, there are really two cardinal, to use that word, features of being human. And we have touched on these briefly, especially Yves during his introduction yesterday. One of them, of course, is our commitment to upright walking or bipedalism. This seems to be one of the earliest distinguishing features of being placed on the human family tree rather than on the ape family tree. The other, of course, is our remarkable size and complexity, and I will leave the complexity to the following speakers, of our brain, of the modern human brain, which is some 3 to 4 times the size of our most ancient ancestors. So just how big are our brains? As we look around this room, we see some variation, obviously. And in 2019, there was a comparative phylogenetic analysis of brains that looked much more broadly at the order primates, which includes monkeys, apes, and ourselves. And in that article, they concluded that the primate brain of our body mass should be something like 440 cc's. Obviously, the human brain has an average here, depends who you read, but roughly 1480 cc's. And that is incredibly important to look at because that's 238% larger than an anticipated brain of a primate our size. So today I will consider how humans came to have such a large brain. We have to go back to Charles Darwin and remind ourselves that in 1871, in his Descent of Man, Darwin offered this scenario to explain how we became human. He surmised that our ancestors, or proto-humans, left their arboreal habitats for terrestrial living. As children, we climb trees from time to time, but we are committed terrestrial bipeds. And he further said that this freed our upper limbs, our forelimbs, to be used for other things than locomotion. And he suggested that this was to make and use tools. And further, he said that this demanded some level of intelligence beyond that of the African apes. And making tools drove selection for brain enlargement. We now have, fortunately, through the efforts of many paleoanthropologists, a fossil record for human evolution that allows us a closer look at Darwin's model and reveals for the first time the timing for the appearance of these features: upright walking, brain enlargement, and culture that he used to define humans. The oldest evidence for upright walking, for bipedalism, reaches back to 6 million years, maybe further. Tools do not appear in the archaeological record till roughly 3 million years ago. And you will all understand, I think, from some of the discussions yesterday, that virtually everything we say in paleoanthropology is always open to different views, but certainly by 3 million, our ancestors were beginning to make tools purposefully and use them. But brain expansion, really significant brain expansion, as we will see, does not appear until about 1.5 million years ago. So while Darwin was correct about the importance of these features for defining us as humans, he was incorrect to assume that they all appeared simultaneously. Raymond Dart, who discovered the first Australopithecus, the oldest human ancestor at that time, in South Africa, known as the Taung Baby or Taung child, really confirmed Darwin's prediction that humans who most closely resemble, or our ancestor, or our gorilla and chimps that so closely resemble us, this led to the conclusion that the most ancient ancestors would be found in Africa. And as we heard yesterday, when we talked about the diffusion of myths, diffusion of people, migrations of people, like Rome, all roads lead here, and on the human phylogenetic tree, all roads lead back to Africa as the crucible for human origins. Dart proposed that the Taung's cranium, the face, and the endocast, although he was incorrect in some of his observations about the endocast, shed light on the origins of bipedalism and human evolution. He drew attention to the foramen magnum we heard about yesterday, that where the spinal cord leaves the brain case faces downwards, and concluded that the cardinal feature of upright walking or bipedalism was represented in this creature. He named it Australopithecus africanus, somewhat of a misnomer. It really is southern ape of Africa. They've often been called man apes. I think we can all agree that the principal biological purpose of the brain is to generate behaviors that benefit survival. Any adaptation that is to generate behaviors that benefit survival will be selected for. This enhances survivorship and reproduction of a species, and this has high selective value within the paradigm of the theory of evolution. So let's look at how we can use that perspective to better comprehend how a positive feedback process drove human brain evolution. Although the fossil record for our hominin ancestors is patchy, we have a reasonable appreciation of the tempo and mode of human brain expansion. Obviously, there is a trend towards increase in endocranial volume over time, beginning with the appearance of Australopithecus afarensis, which is the species to which Lucy gave her name, followed by Homo habilis and by Homo ergaster in particular, and ultimately to the encephalization of Homo neanderthalensis and Homo sapiens. So let's have a quick look at the evidence for the fossil evidence. Sahelanthropus chadensis was recovered from 7 million year old sediments in North Central Africa in Chad, and it's purported to be the most ancient hominin ancestor, with an endocranial volume of only about 350 cubic centimeters. It's well within the range of chimpanzees. Although there is disagreement as to the phylogenetic placement of this specimen on the human family tree, perhaps its brain volume reflects that of the common ancestor to African apes and hominins. The skeleton of Ardipithecus at 4.4 million years from Aramis, Ethiopia, possessed a skull with an endocranial volume of somewhere between 300 and 350, essentially identical with Sahelanthropus, yet separated by quite a long period, and equal to the average brain size we see in chimpanzees. So we don't see any significant increase in cranial capacity here. Until recently, the species Australopithecus anamensis, dating between 3.8 and 4.2 million years ago, was known only from jaws and teeth discovered in northern Kenya. The recent discovery by an Ethiopian researcher who is now the new director of the Institute of Human Origins, Johannes Haile Selassie, of a 3.8 million-year-old cranium in Ethiopia's Afar region, yielded an endocranial volume of only about 370 cubic centimeters. Again, essentially no significant increase in brain size. Of course, the species most dear to Eve and myself is Australopithecus afarensis, which lived between 3 and 3.9 million years ago and is known from well over 500 fossil specimens. The best known, of course, being the Lucy specimen. And based on 4 adult specimens in a recent paper, using CAT scans and so on to reconstruct endocranial volume, we see that the average cranial capacity for afarensis is 455, with a range from 382 to 522 cubic centimeters. And these 4 estimates come from roughly 3.1, 3.2 million years in age. And this is a 20% increase in cranial capacity as compared to chimpanzees. And it is tempting to see this as the first glimmer of hominin brain enlargement. Charting the growth of afarensis brains has been made possible because of 2 infant skulls, one from the site of Hadar and one from a site very nearby known as Dikika. And what is interesting about this is that comparing dental development with brain capacity, we see that there is a somewhat protracted, elongated period of infant dependency. This is in contrast to what we see in the apes, which reach adult brain size earlier and experience much shorter periods of dependency. What this means in terms of behavior remains to be understood. Our knowledge, as you can see, of hominid brain evolution is largely based on observations of endocranial capacity, but paleoneurologists have attempted to tease additional information from endocasts that preserve the external topography, the various valleys and hills of the neocortex that are impressed on the inner table of the cranium. In this case, we have a number of endocasts that have been created using various methods that indicate a more anterior placement of the lunate sulcus in the occipital region, which is reminiscent of what we see in apes, rather than our positioning, which is much more posterior. And this implies something quite interesting in terms of brain reorganization, that the increase in endocranial volume seems to precede reorganization of the brain. As we move on, we have a mandible that's at least 2.8 million years of Homo, but there are no cranial remains associated with it. And it isn't until about 1 million years later, at around 1.8 million years, around 2 million years, shall we say, we see a notable increase in the species Homo habilis. Habilis meaning handy, that reflects the fact that stone tools were found with them. And it's fascinating that Raymond Dart is the man who suggested that it be called Homo habilis, not Louis Leakey. And this is around 2 million years with an average of about 616 cc's, which is a notable increase of some 30% over afarensis. I want to draw attention here to the association, and this is particularly true at Oldowan Gorge, of stone artifacts that are referred to as the Oldowan tool tradition, consisting of flakes and pebble tools. Oldowan tools have now been discovered in sediments that go back almost to 2.7 million. Eve yesterday suggested that they may go back to over 3 million years, but tools that are regularly fashioned in this manner are not, we don't know anything about them before 3 million years ago. So it's around that time that we see a major behavioral change in, and what that reflects, I'll return to shortly. Homo ergaster, which is sometimes referred to as the African Homo erectus, is the first hominin to exit Africa. When I was a student at the University of Chicago, we thought it was much, much later, only maybe 400 or 500,000 years ago. But here, a long time, obviously, before we controlled fire, a long time before we had very sophisticated toolkits, hominins were curious enough to leave Africa. And of course, the major sample comes from Georgia. But Homo ergaster was named on specimens from Lake Turkana in northern Kenya, and have an average endocranial capacity of over 854 cc's, a notable increase in size. Now, Homo ergaster appears to have exploited more savanna-like habitats, according to the paleoenvironmental studies. The greater diversity of stone tools associated with Homo ergaster reflects, I think, an increase in cognitive capacity. We see the glimmerings of what we would call the amygdala or the hand axe in the lower left-hand corner. We see bodies of modern proportions. We see significant brain expansion. And archaeologists have inferred from the associations of stones and bones with these somewhat more advanced tools that this was a time when our ancestors were beginning to participate in targeted hunting. Earlier examples, and there is great debate about this at Oldowan, and before that, that hominins were not really hunting, but more participating more in scavenging. And it is interesting that as soon as tools appear in the record, we see a very significant change in the composition of the non-hominin fauna. For example, at Hadar, where we have never found any stone tools, we find beautifully complete specimens of legs and arms and so on. As soon as we pass that 3 million mark and look in sediments that do have stone tools, we see that the bones are broken up to extract bone marrow, and there are cut marks on these bones. So there's a dramatic change in sort of the appearance of the bones once stone tools come into the archaeological record. By the Middle Pleistocene, skulls of Homo heidelbergensis, we are unfortunately stuck with this name, but Homo heidelbergensis, these creatures have endocranial volumes within the modern human range, interestingly, but they retain very rugged facial morphology and elongated brain cases typical of Homo ergaster or Homo erectus. It's generally agreed that the most ancient examples of this hominin, Homo heidelbergensis, appeared in Africa more than 600,000 years ago. And it is the common ancestor to Homo sapiens and Neanderthals. Homo sapiens in Africa and Neanderthals in Europe. One of the very important things to remember, aside from the names of these creatures is that reproductive isolation brings these creatures under very different situations. In Europe, Neanderthals were isolated genetically from what was going on in Africa and vice versa. And they were leading quite different lives. And through things like genetic drift or mutation and adaptation, for example, they developed their own particular morphology or anatomy. Both, as I said, evolved larger brains, which is very interesting to observe, but had distinctly different shapes, as you heard yesterday. Neanderthals retained the elongated skull form, while Homo sapiens skulls became more globular and with vertical foreheads, smaller, more gracile or lightly built faces. And comparisons of Neanderthal and recent modern human endocasts indicates the presence of an expanded cerebellum and bulging parietal lobes in Homo sapiens. While the nature of the cognitive capacity between these two species is still being debated, we see that Neanderthals all the time are seen to be elevated a little bit more with further discoveries, as Professor Dorico told us yesterday in his wonderful presentation, that we must note that it was Neanderthals that did go extinct, and we are the sole survival of hominids on this planet. The most ancient skull of Homo sapiens perhaps comes from Jebel Irhoud in Morocco, dated to about 300,000 years. And the skull, interestingly, exhibits a mosaic of features, including a Homo sapiens-like face and a more primitive, elongated cranium. This mosaic of features is also something that is very important to remember when we consider the evolution of any mammal, and particularly humans, that everything wasn't magically changed at once. There were sequences of changes which allow us to understand the sort of mode as well as the tempo of evolutionary change. So, and you can see Jebel Irhoud here with a cranial capacity of 1375, well within the range of modern humans. So let's return to the earliest appearance of Homo and consider the initial spark that led to larger brains. Paleo-environmental studies in Eastern Africa indicate that approximately 3 million years ago, there was a cooling and drying trend. And this may have played a crucial role in our evolution. The forested habitats were obviously retreating to the west. That's where the apes continued to live. I think when you have climatic change like this, you can either try to follow the sort of habitat you're accustomed to, you can adapt to the new environments, or experience extinction. But I believe that this climatic change may have played a crucial role. Forested habitats were being replaced with more open bushland and savanna environments. And as hominins moved into these unfamiliar landscapes, they encountered, I think, a variety of challenges, including predator pressure, which they did not have, and very importantly, the search for new food sources that had been left behind in the forests. In my model of human origins, which is this phylogenetic hypothesis I present here, I suggest that afarensis was the last common ancestor to at least 2, and probably certainly 3 and maybe more, evolutionary outcomes. Species of Australopithecus descended from afarensis continue to be closely adapted to plant-based diets. And from trace elements, we know that these consisted largely of things like grasses and sedges. And the continuation of a plant-based diet, a low-quality diet, was quite successful for a long time, for at least 1.5 million years. You see two species here, Aethiopicus and boisei, that have particular anatomical adaptations to that diet, and I suspect also physiological adaptations. But over time, this lineage made one of the great evolutionary mistakes of becoming much too specialized. So when they faced increasing competition from grazing antelopes and gazelles, and probably also gelada baboons, they faced extinction around 1 million years ago. So they did not have high adaptability. They were highly adapted, but they did not have that level of adaptability that assures success in an evolutionary model. Australopithecus afarensis also spawned the genus Homo. You see a small picture of the mandible there at about 2.8. And it is an interesting mandible. It was found by Kay Reed, who was also at the Institute of Human Origins. And in the anterior part of the mandible, it looks very much like a mandible of afarensis. But the posterior aspect of it looks like a member of the genus Homo. And it is placed in the genus Homo, but we don't know what species it belongs to because we really need more cranial remains. And at the moment, there is research undergoing to ascertain what kinds of animals were found with this. There was an elephant kill nearby. So this may be some of our oldest evidence of the Oldowan stone tools. So the association of cut, marked, and broken bones is very significant. With rudimentary stone tools, we see that there is a change in diet. I suspect, as I said before, that the earliest hominins, like Homo habilis, for example, and probably Homo spa, we don't know what that is at 2.6 or 2.7, were scavenging carnivore kills. But the evidence is clear here that we have a simple flake. I'm holding these things in my hand everywhere, it looks like. And you have on the upper right a piece of antelope mandible, and you can see clearly the telltale cut marks where that was disarticulated 1.8 million years ago. You see these large pebble tools at Oldowan that were purposefully brought from a long distance, the raw materials to make these tools. So there is some planning and insight going into this. And you see in the lower right, a long bone of a large African antelope that even hyenas could not get into. But within those bones is a very important food source, which is bone marrow. And with simply smashing that bone, and you see the signs of where it was smashed, and twisting it like that, we now have a very high quality food that becomes available. And such activities, even as scavenging, I think favored group cooperation and somewhat brighter brains to understand the behavior of both predator and prey. So how did protein contribute to the success of the Homo lineage? Well, the simple answer is that it fed a hungry, growing brain. In 1995, Aiello and Wheeler proposed what they call the expensive tissue hypothesis that drew attention to the fact that the brain and a number of other organs, such as the heart, kidneys, liver, and gut, use significant amounts of energy. So if you have a higher quality diet, you can reduce the gut size, you can release some of the energy that was usurping to be redirected to feed a hungry brain. And this hypothesis, that they hypothesize that only by reducing the energy budget of other organs could more energy become available for a growing brain. It's simply not possible to reduce the size of the liver, kidneys, or heart, but changing to a diet that demands less energy for digestion can reduce gut size. And here is, you see in their hypothesis, you have what is observed on the left and what is expected on the right in a primate of about 65 kilos. I'm just almost finished. And you see that the liver, kidney, and heart remain about the same size. The brain in the observed, which is us, is much larger, and our gut is significantly reduced. And we see that this is exactly what happened in the evolution of Homo. And comparatively speaking, people have looked at other primates and they see the same level of relationship. So the switch from a plant-based diet to a reduced diet to a higher energy diet allowed the metabolic cost of the gastrointestinal tract to be reduced. And I would be remiss if I didn't say that it isn't just size that's important. It isn't just the size of the cranial vault. The brain, as we will hear in subsequent talks this morning, there is considerably significant reorganization within the brain. Now, this is, I will just mention briefly, Homo floresiensis from the Malay archipelago that lived between 50 and say 100,000 years ago. And look at the small brain size, 417 cc's. It's associated with stone tools. It's associated with evidence for hunting. So it isn't just size that's important. In conclusion, I would say it was the powerful synergy of ecological, dietary, and social drivers that led to the tripling of hominid brain size over a relatively short span of time. A brain uniquely organized to support symbolic language and foster incomparable levels of intraspecific cooperation, which has generated unlimited cultural and technological innovation. Thank you very much.